The most profound, chilling difference between the two superpowers lay not in the size of their missile arsenals, but in the space between a citizen and the state. In the United States, that space was fiercely defended by the Constitution, a legal wall built on the principle of limited government. The American citizen possessed specific, enumerated rights: the right to free speech, the right to assembly, the right to privacy, and the critical safeguard of the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination, which guaranteed that no one could be forced to testify against themselves. These rights were the bedrock of habeas corpus and due process, ensuring that the state had to follow strict, known rules before it could deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. The individual was legally protected from arbitrary power across the Iron Curtain. The Soviet citizen was theoretically guaranteed rights by the Soviet Constitution, but this document was a political fiction, a propaganda tool. The legal system was not based on the rule of law, the concept that the law stands above the state, but on the dictatorship of the proletariat, where the law was merely a flexible instrument wielded by the Communist Party to enforce its political will. The individual possessed no inherent rights against the state, only privileges granted and revoked by the party. The difference was existential. The American feared a large government. The Soviet citizen feared the sudden, unannounced knock on the door, the final, terrifying symbol of arbitrary power that could instantly erase their life. And if you watch until the end, you will understand how the terrifying simplicity of the KGB's power made every single Soviet citizen an inhabitant of an invisible prison. The concept of privacy and the sanctity of the home was perhaps the most visceral contrast. For the American, the home was a sanctuary, protected by the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable searches and seizures. A police officer required a legally obtained warrant, based on probable cause, signed by a judge, before they could legally cross the threshold of a private residence. This legal safeguard ensured that the citizen possessed a physical, private space where the state was explicitly forbidden, establishing a boundary between public authority and private life. For the Soviet citizen, the home was an open book to the state. The KGB and the militia possessed sweeping, often unwritten authority to search, seize, and enter private residences without judicial oversight. Warrants were a mere bureaucratic formality, or often ignored entirely in cases deemed political or anti-Soviet. The lack of legal protection meant that the Soviet citizen lived in a state of perpetual psychological tension, knowing that private conversations could be overheard, private documents seized, and their personal space violated at any moment by agents of the state. This lack of privacy extended beyond the physical home to the workplace, the phone line, and the mail, establishing an environment of totalized surveillance. The American lived under the protection of the Constitution. The Soviet lived under the gaze of the party. The loss of privacy was not a minor inconvenience. It was the foundation of the state's total control over thought and action, forcing the individual into a state of constant, debilitating self-censorship. The crucial difference in judicial independence and the role of the jury defined the fairness of the two systems. The American legal system rests on the principle of judicial independence. Judges are not subject to political pressure from the executive or legislative branches, and the trial by a jury of peers, a safeguard that places the power of guilt or innocence in the hands of ordinary citizens, ensuring that the state's case must persuade the public, not just a state-appointed official. This system, though imperfect, is designed to ensure fairness, impartiality, and the protection of the minority against the power of the majority. The Soviet legal system had no genuine judicial independence. Judges were party members, appointed and removable by the party. And the legal outcome of any case deemed politically sensitive was almost always dictated in advance by the party Central Committee or the KGB. The courtroom was merely a theater for show trials, designed to publicly validate the party's narrative of guilt. There was no true jury of peers. Instead, a people's assessor, a politically reliable citizen, sat alongside the judge, their role being purely ceremonial. The difference was fundamental. The American system demanded that the state prove guilt to the people. The Soviet system demanded that the people affirm the state's declaration of guilt. for the accused Soviet citizen. The trial was not a search for truth, but a ritual of predetermined punishment, stripping them of any hope of impartial justice. The terrifying power of the KGB versus the FBI illustrates the difference between an intelligence agency subservient to the law and one that is the law. The American FBI operates under the strict legal constraints of the U.S. Constitution, required to obtain warrants, adhere to due process, and is subject to congressional oversight and judicial review. While powerful, it is legally and structurally subordinate to the rule of law, with its power limited by the rights of citizens. The Soviet KGB, Committee for State Security, was a state within a state, an all-pervasive, omnipresent intelligence and secret police agency whose primary function was not just counterintelligence, but total political control and ideological enforcement over the domestic population. The KGB operated above the formal Soviet legal code, acting as investigator, prosecutor, and often the effective judge. Its power was arbitrary, absolute, and defined by the needs of the party. The KGB's reach extended into every aspect of Soviet life: the military, the factory, the university, the home, and its network of informers, Sotraniki, turned neighbors, colleagues, and even family members into potential spies. The American citizen viewed the FBI as a law enforcement agency. The Soviet citizen viewed the KGB as an ever-present, terrifying political reality. The American feared crime. The Soviet feared the state. The power of the KGB was the most potent daily reminder that in the USSR, the party was the ultimate law, and individual rights were a lethal delusion. The critical safeguard of habeas corpus and the right to counsel highlights the individual's standing against the state in the U.S. The principle of habeas corpus, the right to be brought before a judge to determine if your imprisonment is lawful, and the Sixth Amendment right to effective legal counsel are fundamental protections against indefinite, secret detention. A citizen, rich or poor, had the right to a defense lawyer whose professional and ethical duty was to defend their client against the state. The Soviet system lacked any meaningful guarantee of habeas corpus. The KGB could detain individuals for extended periods in secret confinement without formal charges or timely judicial review, and the right to a defense lawyer was often a cynical joke in cases deemed political. The lawyer's primary loyalty was often to the party, not to the client. The defense was merely a formality in a show trial, with lawyers often pressured to persuade their clients to confess to fictitious crimes. This difference meant that the American, once arrested, immediately gained a set of constitutional rights and an advocate. The Soviet, once arrested, immediately lost all effective rights and faced the full, unconstrained power of the KGB. The power to make the citizen simply disappear into the Gulag archipelago was the final, brutal truth of Soviet justice, proving that without the fundamental Western legal safeguards, the individual stands utterly naked and defenseless before the state. The psychological and legal difference inherent in confession and interrogation was a chasm between the two systems. In the U.S., the principle of innocent until proven guilty and the Fifth Amendment right to remain silent are cornerstones of criminal justice. Police interrogations are strictly regulated. Suspects have the right to legal counsel, and any confession obtained under duress is automatically inadmissible in court. The burden of proof rests entirely on the state, which must gather physical and testimonial evidence that stands up to adversarial legal scrutiny. This legal environment protects the accused from coercion and forced self-incrimination. The Soviet system operated under the chilling, effective principle that the confession is the queen of evidence, an inversion of justice where the primary goal of the investigator, KGB or militia, was to extract a full, written confession, regardless of the truth. The lack of effective legal counsel during interrogation, the absence of judicial oversight, and the reliance on relentless psychological pressure, isolation, and occasionally physical coercion meant that confessions were frequently forced. The Soviet system incentivized the investigator not to solve the crime, but to secure the confession, placing the suspect under immense existential pressure to comply with a narrative of guilt dictated by the party. The American suspect silence was protected by the Constitution. The Soviet suspect silence was interpreted as an act of political defiance, making the interrogation room a place not of legal inquiry, but of ideological extraction, where the accused was coerced into validating the state's narrative of their own guilt, a profound and terrifying violation of human dignity. The contrast in political dissent and freedom of speech was the clearest indicator of the underlying structure of power. The U.S. Constitution, through the First Amendment, guarantees freedom of speech, assembly, and the press, allowing citizens to openly criticize the government, advocate for radical change, and organize protests without fear of state reprisal, short of incitement to violence. This freedom to dissent is viewed as a vital, self-correcting mechanism of democracy. The Soviet system defined any form of open criticism of the Communist Party, its leadership, or its ideology as anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. Article 70 of the Criminal Code. This broad, flexible charge was used to criminalize mere thought, private conversation, writing, or disseminating unauthorized information. Samizdat. Transforming political dissent from a legal right into a severe criminal offense punishable by years in the Gulag. The KGB maintained a relentless ideological patrol, monitoring private conversations and cultural output, ensuring that the Soviet citizen lived under the constant threat of prosecution simply for holding or expressing unauthorized thoughts. The American citizen used the Constitution to challenge the state. The Soviet state used the law to crush the spirit of dissent. The consequence was a society defined by a public culture of forced conformity and a private culture of cynical, whispered rebellion. The loss of free speech was not just a political constraint, it was the erasure of the individual's inner life and intellectual autonomy. The structure of property rights and economic autonomy provided a critical layer of protection in the U.S. that was completely absent in the USSR. The American system protects private property as a fundamental right, guaranteeing that the state cannot seize assets without due process and just compensation, eminent domain. This protection ensures that the individual's economic life, their home, savings, and business is secure against arbitrary government action, establishing a foundation for economic independence that is crucial for political freedom. The Soviet system was founded on the abolition of private property, with all major assets, land, factories, housing, owned by the state. The individual's economic existence was entirely dependent on the centralized planning and political approval of the party. The individual could not own the means of production or accumulate substantial capital independently, making them economically subservient to the state. This economic dependence was a powerful form of political control, ensuring that the citizen could not use independent wealth to fund dissent, organize opposition, or gain political autonomy. The American citizen's economic power was a shield against state overreach. The Soviet citizen's total economic reliance on the state was a source of political vulnerability. The lack of property rights was the hidden handcuff that kept the entire population tied to the demands of the party. The fundamental differences in law enforcement culture and accountability were glaring. The American police, or militia in the Soviet context, operate under the legal expectation of equal protection under the law, meaning law enforcement is ostensibly bound to treat all citizens equally, and officers are subject to internal oversight, civilian complaints, and judicial review for abuses of power. This system, while flawed, provides mechanisms for accountability. The Soviet militia and the KGB operated under a system where political reliability trumped legal adherence. Party members and high-ranking officials were often de facto above the law, while ordinary citizens, particularly dissidents or minority groups, were treated arbitrarily. The internal culture of law enforcement was defined by rigid hierarchy and political loyalty, with little meaningful avenue for an ordinary citizen to complain about or seek redress for abuse by an officer or a KGB agent, the officer's primary accountability was upward to the party, not outward To the public, this created a culture of impunity where law enforcement often acted as an instrument of political and social control. Rather than as protectors of the law, the American citizen could hire a lawyer to challenge police power. The Soviet citizen's only recourse was often desperate, private appeals that were typically ignored. A chilling reminder that in the USSR, some citizens were more equal than others, particularly when it came to being protected by the law. The terrifying final step in the Soviet legal process, the sentencing and the Gulag system, provided the ultimate illustration of the state's cruelty. The American justice system, by the 1970s, utilized a complex system of incarceration, parole, and legal appeals, designed, at least officially, for punishment and rehabilitation, and prisoners, despite being deprived of liberty, retained basic constitutional rights. The Soviet system utilized incarceration as a tool of political, economic, and social purification. The vast network of labor camps, the Gulag Archipelago, was not primarily about punishment. It was about forced labor and the removal of undesirable elements from the body politic. The conditions were brutal, defined by starvation, overwork, and rampant abuse, and the entire system operated outside the veneer of socialist legality. Sentences were often disproportionate, appeals were virtually meaningless, and prisoners were stripped of all effective rights. The existence of the Gulag was the final, terrifying enforcement mechanism for the entire structure of Soviet control, ensuring that anyone who dared to challenge the state or question its ideology faced a fate far worse than mere imprisonment. The American prison was a place of confinement. The Soviet Gulag was a place of erasure. The difference was total. One system sought to punish crime, the other sought to eliminate dissent, making the Soviet justice system the most frightening and effective tool of totalitarian power. The legal status of the suspect and the police power represented the ultimate test of individual protection. In the United States, once a suspect is detained, the landmark Miranda rights must be read, informing them of their constitutional right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. The police's power is legally constrained by the necessity of obtaining admissible evidence, and the legal system is adversarial, meaning the prosecution, the state, faces an equally empowered defense. This legal framework is designed to prevent coerced confessions and to ensure that the police themselves operate within the bounds of the law. The Soviet legal code provided no meaningful equivalent to the Miranda rights. The suspect was immediately viewed as guilty by the investigating bodies, KGB or militia, and the entire focus of the detention was on securing the confession that the party required. The power of the investigator was virtually absolute, operating in secrecy and often using techniques of sleep deprivation, isolation, and threats to break the will of the accused. The lack of an independent defense attorney during the critical interrogation phase ensured that the state's narrative of guilt was implanted without challenge. The American suspect's rights created a buffer zone between the individual and the raw power of law enforcement. The Soviet suspect was instantly submerged into a system designed to strip them of agency and force compliance. The procedural differences were not minor bureaucratic details. They were the difference between justice and systemic abuse, demonstrating that the Soviet state did not merely seek to punish criminals, but to eliminate those who challenged its authority, regardless of factual guilt. The use of the legal profession as a shield versus a state tool fundamentally altered the protection available to citizens. The American lawyer operates under strict professional ethics and client privilege, with an unwavering legal and ethical duty to advocate for the client's best interests, regardless of the client's alleged guilt or public opinion. The lawyer is the citizen's primary defense against the power of the state, a vital, protected intermediary. The Soviet lawyer, especially in political cases, was an agent of the state, bound primarily by loyalty to the Communist Party and the necessity of upholding the socialist legal narrative. Defense attorneys were often pressured by the KGB or the party to convince their clients to plead guilty, to minimize the defense's efforts, or even to denounce their clients publicly. The defense speech in a Soviet political trial was frequently a cynical, ritualistic admission of the client's mistakes, rather than a genuine defense of innocence. This meant that the individual facing the Soviet justice system was, in effect, abandoned by their own supposed offender. The American legal profession was a fiercely independent pillar of democracy. The Soviet legal profession was a subservient branch of the totalitarian bureaucracy. The lawyer's failure to serve the client was a direct consequence of the state's failure to guarantee the rule of law, proving that without an independent and ethical legal profession, all other constitutional rights are rendered meaningless. The economic and political leverage of exile and loss of citizenship was a unique tool of Soviet control that dwarfed any punishment in the U.S. While the American government could imprison a citizen, it generally could not, short of specific military circumstances, strip a citizen of their nationality or forcibly exile them. The citizen retained a legal connection to their homeland and the protection of a U.S. embassy abroad. The Soviet state used the chilling power of stripping citizenship and forced exile against high-profile dissidents, writers, and cultural figures such as Solzhenitsyn and Brodsky. This act was designed to be the ultimate humiliation, severing the individual's legal and physical ties to their country, effectively making them stateless and placing them outside the protective reach of any formal legal code. This power was an ideological weapon, eliminating dissent without the messy spectacle of a long public trial, ensuring the physical removal of critical voices, without creating martyrs within the system. This practice was a terrifying example of the Soviet state's belief that it held absolute ownership over the identity and fate of its citizens, a power that the American legal system, built on the inherent rights of the individual, would never permit. The American feared a prison sentence. The Soviet dissident feared legal non-existence, to be rendered a non-person by the state's arbitrary decree. The difference in social control and the informer network created fundamentally different public spheres. The American legal system relies on a decentralized, public-facing model of law enforcement. The fear of arrest is directed at breaking the specific laws, not at the continuous scrutiny of one's private life. The Soviet system relied on a vast, ubiquitous network of informants, SEK, Sotrudniki, neighbors, colleagues, janitors, even family members recruited and manipulated by the KGB. This network transformed the entire society into a mechanism of self-policing and political paranoia, ensuring that every citizen was both a potential informer and a potential suspect. The law was enforced not just by police, but by the pervasive, invisible fear of denunciation. This total social control meant that the most dangerous crime was not stealing, but trusting the wrong person. This created a deep cultural and psychological isolation, forcing the Soviet citizen to construct a complex public persona of loyalty while maintaining a hidden, cynical private self. The American lived under the shadow of the law. The Soviet lived under the shadow of the informant. The social cost of this system was the destruction of mutual trust, the fundamental building block of a healthy civil society, proving that the Soviet state valued control over cohesion. The ultimate contrast lies in accountability and the possibility of redress for abuse. The American citizen, if abused by law enforcement or wrongfully imprisoned, possesses the right to appeal, to sue the state or the officers involved, and to seek financial compensation and public exoneration. This legal avenue for redress is a critical element of the rule of law, ensuring that the state is not above the very laws it enforces. The Soviet citizen had virtually no meaningful avenue for legal redress against the KGB or the party bureaucracy for wrongful arrest, forced confession, or gulag abuse. The state's actions were inherently correct and shielded from scrutiny. The fear of reprisal for merely asking a question ensured that the vast majority of abuses went unreported and uncorrected, creating a culture of impunity where the state could act with guaranteed finality. The American system was designed to acknowledge its errors and correct them through legal mechanisms. The Soviet system was ideologically incapable of admitting error, treating any suggestion of state misconduct as an act of anti-Soviet slander. The freedom to sue the state is the ultimate sign of a society where the individual possesses power. The inability to challenge the state's actions is the ultimate sign of a society where the individual is powerless and expendable. The ultimate difference between the two legal systems was their fundamental goal and philosophy. The American legal system, derived from Enlightenment principles, was philosophically centered on protecting the individual from the state, viewing the government's power as inherently dangerous and requiring constant constitutional checks and balances. The law was a barrier, a shield designed to guarantee that liberty was the default status. The Soviet system, rooted in Marxist-Leninist ideology, was philosophically centered on protecting the party and the state from the individual, viewing the law as a flexible tool to ensure the continuous ideological purity and political stability of the regime. The law was a weapon, a means of enforcing the dictatorship of the proletariat. The result was two societies that approached justice from diametrically opposed starting points. One where the state had to earn the right to interfere with a citizen's life, and one where the citizen had to prove their worthiness to be left alone. This philosophical chasm explained why the American system generated complex legal debates over due process and privacy, while the Soviet system generated fear, secrecy, and the pervasive culture of self-censorship. The lack of foundational legal guarantees meant that the Soviet citizen could never truly possess an inner life, a private conversation, or an independent thought that was genuinely safe from the state's all-consuming power, making the Soviet legal structure the most effective, chilling instrument of totalitarian control ever devised. The specific tool of political defamation and samizdat highlighted the state's fear of uncontrolled information. In the U.S., while libel and slander laws exist, they set a high bar for prosecution, particularly against public figures, protecting the citizen's ability to criticize and report, and the printing press was entirely free. The Soviet state used criminal law to punish any form of dissent or unsanctioned information sharing as anti-Soviet agitation, targeting the very act of independent thought and journalism. The existence of samizdat, the heroic clandestine process of typing or copying forbidden texts, was a direct response to this censorship, transforming the simple act of reading and sharing unauthorized literature into an act of political defiance. The American citizen was constantly bombarded by competing, open information streams. The Soviet citizen had to risk their liberty to access a single, unedited document. This legal suppression of information was crucial to maintaining the ideological fiction of the Communist Party's infallibility, ensuring that the Soviet citizen, living in an information vacuum, was unable to objectively compare their reality with the outside world or with the state's own promises. The law was used not just to control the body, but to control the mind, creating an environment where truth was a dangerous commodity. The comparison in the management of bureaucracy and official corruption demonstrates the systemic difference in integrity. The American legal system, through its free press, independent judiciary, and specific laws targeting official misconduct and bribery, provided mechanisms for citizens to report and prosecute corrupt officials. These legal tools, while not eliminating corruption, ensured a level of accountability and transparency that served as a brake on state power. The Soviet bureaucracy was a massive, impenetrable wall characterized by endemic, pervasive corruption, blat, that was often sanctioned or ignored at the highest levels of the party. The law was rarely, if ever, used to hold high-ranking party officials accountable for corruption or abuse of power. Instead, the legal system was often used to punish low-level scapegoats or political rivals. This legal impunity meant that the party elite operated above the very laws they imposed on the populace, creating a cynical, two-tiered system of justice. The American legal structure aimed to expose official abuse. The Soviet legal structure aimed to protect official abuse. This protection of corruption eroded public trust and further demonstrated that the law was a flexible tool for the powerful, not a neutral instrument for the just. The emotional and psychological cost of this legal environment was devastating for the Soviet citizen. The constant, pervasive fear, the fear of the informer, the fear of a late-night knock, the fear of accidentally uttering a forbidden phrase, created a society suffering from collective psychological trauma. This anxiety was a direct, measurable consequence of the legal system's failure to provide protection or predictability. The American citizen's life was predictable based on the written law, giving them the confidence to pursue private interests and public discourse. The Soviet citizen's life was unpredictable, hostage to the shifting political whims of the party, forcing them into a defensive, fearful stance. This fear was the true invisible prison, a constant, debilitating anxiety that shaped every decision, every conversation, and every relationship. The cost of the Soviet legal system was the destruction of civil society, mutual trust, and individual peace of mind. The Soviet system provided the external illusion of safety and stability, but internally, it generated a profound, pervasive sense of personal vulnerability, proving that a law designed to serve the state ultimately destroys the well-being of the people it purports to protect. The final verdict on the legal systems of the Cold War is clear. The American system, for all its financial and racial inequities, was built on the sanctity of the individual, protected by a legally empowered shield, guaranteeing rights even against the state itself. The Soviet system, for all its promises of socialist equality, was built on the supremacy of the party, enforced by an arbitrary weapon, guaranteeing only the right to political obedience, the failure of the Soviet legal structure to provide basic human rights, the right to silence, the right to privacy, the right to a fair trial, was the most powerful evidence that the communist experiment was a fundamental moral failure. The lack of the rule of law ensured that even the most loyal Soviet citizen remained, at all times, a political suspect, ultimately leading to the decay of trust and the quiet collapse of the entire structure. The difference was not in the laws written on paper, but in the power of a simple piece of paper, the warrant signed by a judge or the arbitrary order signed by the KGB. What do you think? Was the bigger danger to the Soviet citizen the lack of technology in the public hospital or the existence of the secret Kremlin clinic for the elite? Share your thoughts below.